My name is Tom Blackson, and this is a video in a series of videos I'm making for a class I teach for ASU. The class is PHI 328, History of Ancient Philosophy. In the last video, I talked about what a history of ancient philosophy is. Ancient philosophy, in the title of this course, refers to a philosophical conversation that took place in the past. A history is an inquiry or investigation. A history of ancient philosophy is an inquiry that attempts to understand how the ancient philosophical conversation started and why it continued in the way it did. We do not know the exact time and place the conversation started, but it's traditional to say that it started with Thales and Miletus in 585 BC. Here we have that claim right here in the lecture notes. Now, 585 BC is the year in which a solar eclipse occurred that Thales predicted. Predicting an eclipse is not a philosophical achievement, so this date is really just a convenient way to mark something else Thales did to which we could not attach a specific date. What he did was engage in what came to be known as the inquiry into nature. Inquiry here is the same Greek word we saw in Herodotus, hysteria. The inquiry into nature is an attempt to explain why things happen in the world in the way they do. Explanations already existed, but the inquiry into nature was distinctive because it was an attempt to provide a new kind of explanation. The existing explanations involve stories about the gods of the kind we find in Hesiod and the theologists. These explanations proceeded on an assumption that was widespread. We noticed that certain things happen in the world in a regular way, and the ancients associated regularity with intelligence. They thought the cause had to be a mind or an intellect. We can see this in a striking passage in Plato's Apology. We can use the Perseus Digital Library to see this passage. It's in the Apology at 26D, and I encourage you to do this. But since I showed you how to use the Perseus Digital Library in a past video, I'm not going to actually go to this passage here. In the passage, Socrates is defending himself against the charge of impiety, on which he was convicted and executed in 399 BCE. In his defense, he says that he, like the rest of mankind, believes that the sun and the moon are gods. The ancients knew that the sun and the moon move with extreme regularity, and they found it natural to think that this could only happen if the sun and the moon were themselves supremely intelligent gods. The Malaysian inquirers into nature challenged this thought. They did not overturn it, though, as we shall see later. Trade in the Eastern Mediterranean was making it clear that there were different ways of life and beliefs both about the world and the place of human beings in it. In the light of these alternatives, there was a desire for answers that did not depend for their authority on the weight of tradition. An example shows how the Malaysian inquirers into nature responded to this desire for a new kind of explanation. They identified something they thought of as the nature of reality, and they had tried to explain changes we see in terms of this nature. Thales thought the nature was water, but it's easier to see how the new explanations were supposed to work if we look to Anaximenes. He identified air as the nature of reality and tried to explain the changes we see in terms of the changes in this nature. In the case of rain, for example, he thought that this happens when the air in the sky condenses. The portions of condensed air constitute droplets of water that fall to the ground as rain. This explanation is very different from the one we find in the traditional stories about the gods. In these stories, Zeus makes the rain. He's responsible for the rains coming and going in the way they do. To believe this, though, we need to have grown up hearing the stories Hesiod and the theologists tell. The explanations in terms of the gods get their authority from the weight of tradition. But the exchange of information that went along with increased trade in the Eastern Mediterranean called this authority into question and gave rise to the desire for a kind of explanation that did not require the weight of tradition for its authority. It is this kind of explanation that the Malaysian inquirers into nature, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, tried to provide. Okay, now that we know what Thales and the Malaysian inquirers did, we can take up the question of how this caused a philosophical tradition to come into existence. Remember that in a history of ancient philosophy, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand how the conversation started and why it unfolded in the way it did. When we say that the tradition is a philosophical tradition, we're saying something about how it came to be understood. The ancient Greek word that transliterates as philosophia does not come common until about the time of Socrates. Now we can see this word if we go down to the bottom of the page here. I try to list important Greek words. Let's see if I did it for philosophia. Yep, here it is. So it's underlined, and so we could click it, and that would take us to the dictionary entry in the Perseus Digital Library. I'm not going to do that, but you can, and I encourage you to do it. It's interesting to look at these things. Okay, now the Malaysians, they did not use this word to describe themselves, right? The word does not become common until about the time of Socrates. But subsequent thinkers, right, do talk about the inquirers into nature as philosophers. Aristotle does, and we rely on him for a lot of our knowledge of the Presocratics. And he does this in the Metaphysics, and I think I have that passage over here in the side notes. Let's take a quick look at it. Yeah, here we go. Thales, the originator of this sort of philosophy, and he uses the Greek word that I was talking about, and he does it in the Metaphysics in Book 1. And if we wanted to go to the Perseus Digital Library and look at this passage, which I suggest you do, we could click right here. Okay. Now, this way of thinking about the inquiry into nature became traditional by the time of Socrates, if not before. And I have the passage down here. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates says that when he was young, he was tremendously eager for the kind of wisdom which they call inquiry about nature, right? So there's the Greek. The Malaysian inquirers into nature pursued wisdom, right? That's how they were understood, and this, right, gave rise, the fact that they were doing this when people were thinking about it, gave rise to an attempt to understand what wisdom is and what we can do, what steps we can take to get it. And this really is why ancient philosophy is traditionally said to begin with Thales. In thinking about what the Malaysian inquirers were doing, a certain understanding of wisdom arose, and this understanding became the dominant view in a philosophical conversation that will last for about 1,000 years. We're going to look at the understanding of wisdom in the next lecture.